next part of our session is a little bit different, but it's also very important because we're now broadening out the scope of the discussion to include what I might call other biological entities beyond us human beings, because animals are very much part of our ecosystem, and be it as animals that are in the wild, animals that are used as agricultural livestock for food production, and obviously companion animals as well that make our lives a happier place. So we've got 3 speakers, all of whom have deep experience and engagement with this world. We have Cyril from the US Department of Agriculture, Marcus Remmers from Merial, and Theo Kanellos from Zoetis. So Merial and Zoetis obviously are 2 animal health companies, and the US Department of Agriculture is obviously a pretty big player in agriculture, given the scale of agriculture in the USA. So Cyril is a vet and a PhD-level microbiologist with a 25-year career in animal health research, working for the US federal government and in industry. Currently national program leader in animal production and protection at the Agriculture Research Service of the US Department of Agriculture. We're going to turn to you first. I think we're going to maybe do the same one after the other, and then we'll have a little group discussion, if that's okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in Lyon, the city that produced the first veterinary school worldwide. So I come from a research background, so I'm going to provide a little different perspective. In research, we have especially a government laboratory where I work, which is the Agricultural Research Service, which is the research branch of the Department of Agriculture in the United States. The analogy in France would be INRA. And since we have base funds that we can depend on, we have the luxury maybe of tackling maybe higher risk, long-term projects that are more difficult for industry to tackle. Industry, in particular pharmaceutical industry, that has to be responsive to shareholders on a quarterly basis. So what I'm going to talk about is 3 things. 1, the drivers of vaccine discovery in the 21st century in animal health. 2nd, I'll talk about some challenges, and then I'll end up with potential solutions. So what are the drivers of vaccine discovery in the 21st century? First of all, we have to look at the need for vaccines for what the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations calls transboundary animal diseases. This is imperative for food security, as many of you, many people around the world, not only developing countries, are dependent on livestock and poultry for their livelihood. So this vaccines to prevent these transboundary animal diseases, which prevent livestock producers with trading with the animals is really an imperative. The second driver of vaccine discovery, I believe, in the 21st century is vaccines that can reduce or perhaps eliminate the use of medically important antibiotics. As you know, a huge crisis is the loss of our antibiotics, either due to antimicrobial resistance or regulatory restrictions. If we have vaccines that can actually prevent the disease, then we will not need to treat those animals. And in veterinary medicine, one of the things that we do quite well, which is especially important from an economic standpoint, is preventive medicine, and vaccines play a key role. And the third driver, which is really critical, as well as this area of emergency vaccination against emerging zoonotic diseases. This is really an imperative for One Health that we previously discussed, and there's huge opportunities actually to link vaccinologists on the human side of the equation as well as the animal health side. So what are the challenges? As we know, has been previously said by the previous speakers, we've made tremendous successes in the world of vaccinology. Starting in the 19th century with the Pasteur rule of vaccinology, where we isolate and inactivate and inject. This is the empirical trial and error experimentation that yielded notable successes, which have already been mentioned, from smallpox to polio to rabies. But we really need to move, from the 19th century approach to a 20th century. And in the 20th century, we actually, in particular in veterinary medicine, we yielded probably unprecedented application of new technologies. You name it, from gene-deleted vaccines to recombinant vectors to DNA vaccines, all of them have been produced and licensed for decades on the veterinary side. And as you know, on the human side, we're just now getting some of our first molecular vaccines. So why have we had those successes, right? It's not that veterinarians are smarter than physicians, but we have the ability in veterinary medicine to actually test these vaccines directly in the target host animals. So we have the animal models, and that provides probably great opportunities for this One Health initiative that I previously mentioned, probably something that we don't pay enough attention to, especially for zoonotic diseases where the disease is actually the same, and in fact the vaccine technology may be the same, or certainly can be tested in an animal model. But this 20th century approach to vaccinology, if you think, still was utilizing an empirical approach. And so we really need to move in the 21st century, because we still have a lot of challenges where we have either no vaccines in the case of African swine fever that is knocking currently at the door of Europe, or we have many vaccines that probably are marginal in their efficacy. For example, porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome vaccines, or maybe even some of our bacterial vaccines that are the most challenging and probably have an impact on the use of antibiotics in animal agriculture and animal health. So moving into solutions, the first one is really moving into vaccine innovation in the 21st century. And what I'd like to put on the table, it may be controversial, but we have to remember that inevitably industry, our pharmaceutical partners, have to focus, as has been previously said, on getting a vaccine developed and licensed, and regulatory affairs plays a key role in that aspect. If the vaccine is not licensed, then we have wasted a lot of funding and have not achieved the goal. But the caveat is that by focusing on the regulatory requirements for vaccine development, we have to remember that we're focusing on the minimum requirements. So in the 21st century, we really have to look at vaccine innovation and taking a systems approach where we can actually look at solving actual problems. The goal is, what is a vaccine profile that we actually need to solve the problem? And in veterinary medicine, this is really critical, because we want to go beyond just preventing clinical signs. We're actually looking to develop vaccines for the purpose of control and, where feasible, eradication. And it's a very different approach, because then we're asking a lot from these vaccines. We want a vaccine to work with just one dose. If you're working with cattle, especially in developing country, or even in countries that are developed, when you're dealing with an emergency disease outbreak, you may only get one chance to vaccinate that animal. So how do you get a vaccine to work with one dose? We want to prevent transmission, right? Just preventing clinical infections or clinical disease is insufficient. We want to be able to do things like implementing DIVA strategies, differentiating infected from vaccinated animals. This is crucial for recovering from a disease outbreak. And of course, our vaccines need to be cost-effective. So vaccine innovation for us in veterinary medicine is going to be really critical, and the application then of new technologies is really part of the solution. And I'd like to suggest that in the 21st century, we really need to embrace new technologies. And as I mentioned, in the 20th century, we have developed a lot of technologies, but there's a lot of new technologies in the pipeline that we really need to take advantage of. We've all heard about technologies such as reverse vaccinology, But what about reverse genetic systems, immunogenetics, technologies such as immune refocusing, or even codon deoptimization? If some of you are interested in what those technologies are, we can discuss this during the lunchtime. But those are important technologies. And going back to the regulators, we're fortunate that the regulatory agencies, I believe, either on the human side or on the veterinary side, do have the regulatory pathways in place that enables the pharmaceutical companies to actually develop and use these new technologies. But there are some issues. And so we really need to look at regulators themselves, because they need to be innovative, they need to be flexible, and they need to be solutions driven. So that would be something that we really need to look, or else, as was previously mentioned, we're not going to be able to use this technology for solving problems, and that's going to be important. The other important part, I believe, in terms of solution, are public-private partnerships that was discussed by the previous panel. And here I'd like to take a different approach and maybe suggest that for us, public-private partnerships are all about deselecting or reducing the risk for our private partner. So, how do we do this? We do this through effective technology transfer. And when you're in academia or government laboratories, we probably don't pay enough attention on technology transfers. We use metrics such as invention disclosures or number of patents submitted. But none of these are going to achieve the goal of developing a vaccine, of licensing that vaccine, and launching that vaccine. So what can an agency, a government agency where I work, like ARS, or maybe INRA, or maybe academia do? On the veterinary side, we don't have a BARDA like you have on the human side. So how do we do this? And this is where these public-private partnerships become important, and de-risk, lowering the risk for our private partners. So I think briefly it starts with proof of concept studies. Proof of concept studies, I'm not talking about mouse studies, but actual efficacy and safety data in a target host, in the relevant animals. This is critical, and once this is achieved, this is probably the trigger for developing a technology transfer plan. In fact, I would say that every research project should have a technology transfer plan. This is absolutely critical. The other thing is academia or government laboratories actually need to look at protecting intellectual property. Not that we're looking for a revenue stream, but there's no way that a commercial partner will go forward and invest in the development of a new technology if they cannot have protection of that intellectual property. And that is very critical. And another idea for people in our scientists in academia and the government is to really work with their Office of Technology Transfer to actually get input, such as doing patent landscape, getting information in terms of the data that needs to be produced to ensure that a patent will be issued. This is another critical steps. Another concept, which is, I believe, novel and that we're able to do in the United States, is to actually have the scientists and the research group participate in the early development. This is something that ARS does with some of its commercial partners, where the commercial partner will provide the master seed and will conduct some of these studies and participate in some of the early development of these vaccines. Another area that's important is funding. I mentioned we don't have a BARDA, so this is something that a government laboratory can produce in terms of providing some of the data to, again, lower the risk for the commercial partner. But funding is a shared responsibility. And there's large pharma, there's biotech companies which may have a technology that we actually need to work with to achieve the goal in solving the problem in terms of a disease. And so there's all sorts of funding opportunities that we need to look at, like SBIR grants of small businesses. And this is something where government laboratories can really help in partnering with these small entities.
Cyril, just need to wrap up a bit now.
So I'll close maybe by talking and finishing about the importance of global partnerships, and mention a few of them in animal health that have been important. One is something that I started several years ago, which is called the Global Foot and Mouth Disease Research Alliance. If you Google GFRA, that's an important organization whereby scientists have come together to actually try to address the problems around this important disease that all of you, I'm sure, know about. Yeah. And subsequent to this, a new organization was produced called STAR-IDAS, which was funded by the European Union, which is the Global Strategic Alliance for the coordination of research on major infectious diseases of animals and zoonoses. This is another critical area where everybody does research, and therefore we can pool our funds and do collaboration around key research priorities. And some of the things that these organizations have done is actually do gap analyses where there can be a focus and a clear investment of research towards these targeted priorities. And the last one that I'll mention is the Global African Swine Fever Research Alliance that we started, and we'll actually have the scientific conference right here in France, in Ploufragan, in September in Brittany, which is another one of these organizations that's trying to pull scientists and industry to work together in concert under public partnerships to enable the development of vaccines such as African swine fever, where after 50 years of research, we still don't have a vaccine. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you. I'm going to move to our next speakers immediately. I'm going to come back for a Q&A after that. So our next speaker is Marcus Remmers. He's the Global Head of Biologicals R&D at Merial, which is the animal health subsidiary of Sanofi, but it's actually based in Duluth, Georgia. Am I right?
Merial is actually based in Lyon, but Merial R&D is based in Duluth, Georgia.
That's my lack of understanding. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think being in animal health vaccines is quite an exciting space because not only do we support the growing population with safe and affordable food, but it's also really the notion of controlling zoonotic and emerging diseases, and it's also ensuring that we have a healthy pet that interacts with its human owner and becomes more and more part of the family. And if we look at it, the vaccine part of the global animal health market has been linearly increasing for the last couple of decades. In fact, it's so linear that you can predict that every 10 to 15 years, it's 5 percentage points of the market that move from treatment to prevention. If you do the extrapolation, around 2150 will sell the last pharmaceutical dose and have the entire market based on vaccines and prevention. And why is that? It's really the strong drivers that we have. There's basically three that we see that move from treatment to prevention. The one is clearly global population growth and globalization, which drives the need for more intense animal production and infectious disease control. We see climate change, which drives infectious diseases. So it's not only the humans that are traveling, it's also the bugs that are traveling, and they bring the diseases with them. We've seen just the outbreak of the blue tongue disease in France earlier this year. And it's lastly the political and the regular framework that keeps emerging. And Cyril, you alluded to the antibiotic replacement need and things of this nature. And all of those keep demanding new solutions, and the answer to that clearly is technologies. Technologies are evolving very fast in many different dimensions. We see them everywhere in academia, in startup and in industry. We monitor them very, very carefully. And in fact, in animal health, we apply them very, very quickly. And I think the point that we need to pay attention to, again, is the fact that the regulatory framework grows and evolves as fast as the technologies, not to become a bottleneck. You alluded to this, and Joris, you mentioned it as well. Thank you for that. I think there's also another dimension, which is the public perception. For example, if we vaccinate a fish with a DNA vaccine, which is a case in point, does the fish now become a GMO organism? And what does it mean for the packaging, for the consumer interaction, and for the way to really bring this technology forward? So big challenges here, and I think, Cormac, you summarized it really well earlier today. It is very complicated.
Mm-hmm. It is, and getting more so. And Theo, you're Director of Strategic Alliances at Zoetis, which is, I guess, a competitor, but colleague as well of the industry. former Pfizer animal health business, right? What's your view of how this world is shaping up?
Yeah, I think first of all, a big thank you for being in this biopartnering event. I'm really happy being here because of the name, and kudos to the people that they found BIOVISION, because at the end of the day, we have all to align on our vision. Either this is public, agencies, or industry, and either they're competitors or not. So from human health or animal health. So from my side, I think kudos to the people that they found this name, and I hope that we will continue the discussion, beyond this panel. So let me give you a few examples where I think they are important and make it quite real. So when you talk about vaccination, everyone knows about the eradication of smallpox, all these fantastic things that vaccination has done. But very few people know that the reason that we have affordable food is because of the vaccination. Every year we have billions of doses going to chickens, to cattle, to sheep, to everywhere. And that's what makes us be able to be healthy and have the food that we need to have. And what that means is that, as an industry, we have a tremendous experience in understanding how do you make the cost of goods low to give, to a chicken that costs, what, 2-3 pounds per kilo? How do you create these vaccines to be effective? So that's a tremendous knowledge that we have and we continue having. Also, it helps societies. We help industries. A typical example is what you said about fish. Aquaculture in Chile almost died, because of a virus. So we had to go quickly, identify vaccines and produce there. So these people, the livelihood of these people is because of the work that we did in vaccines and help, the salmon industry there. So there is a tremendous opportunity and, to continue this growing. All the trends are there, we mentioned it, but prophylaxis is the way forward. In my view, vaccines is one part of the prophylaxis. You need to have diagnostics. You need to go to more solution approach. But I would say that everyone talks about antibiotics, and that's absolutely fine. But from our animal health perspective, something that's quite important is parasitic vaccines. We have a lot of problems there. If you go to Africa, I think people talk about parasites, resistance. The science there hasn't been so advanced to be able to find ways to vaccinate against parasites. So people that are in this audience or companies that they work, I think to me there is a lot of work to be done there. We are pretty good with viral vaccines, with bacterial vaccines, but I think parasitic vaccines is important. And I would like to continue with the technologies and just very quickly say, I love all this genomics, genetics, sequencing. I've done this when I was in the university, and they have given us a lot of value, a lot of information. The important thing is how do you take the value of this information and translate it into a product? And when you try to develop a vaccine for respiratory diseases, then you don't only need to know the sequence of the virus, but this virus will have to interact with bacteria, may have to interact with other viruses, will have to interact with the host. Do you understand how well we can develop vaccines? Because at the end of the day, what a human being wants or an animal is to stop having these respiratory diseases. That's what it is. So I think, again, there is a lot of work to be done there and utilize all these bioinformatics, all these platforms to be able to get the real vaccines out. And finally, I do think that One Health is the way forward for many reasons. If you talk about Zika virus, we know very well how to circumvent, maternal antibodies. We have a lot of experience with peptide vaccines, with a lot of technologies that they were to come in human health, they never materialized, but in animal health, they did materialize. And this gives a different business model that you have to think, and a lot of the small companies sometimes they don't think about, that we can quickly take these technologies together with Marcus and try to bring them into the patients and try to extrapolate from this for human health and to see this continuously. And I believe that for a lot of these emerging infectious diseases, the business model needs to change because we always work on a crisis. We talk about Ebola, we talk about all these things, but the viruses are still there. The tools are there. How do we go ahead to try to eliminate these viruses or eliminate these outbreaks as opposed to wait until we'll have the next epidemic? And the typical example is blue tongue, where one of my other...
Sorry, blue tongue?
Blue tongue. Blue tongue is a major viral disease, that it's an exotic disease, came from Africa a few years ago, almost destroyed part of the industry of the ruminants in Northern Europe. We developed vaccines. All the companies went very fast to develop vaccines. Then, every epidemic, it went down. Even departments stopped funding research on that. Now it's coming back. So it's always with these emerging infectious diseases an epidemic.
But can you pay for everything at the same time? I mean, can you actually say, oh, we've identified 40 potential threats, we're going to run full steam ahead with all 40, or do you just have to, each threat has to sort of reach a certain threshold before you can really put money on it?
Yeah, of course, you cannot go for everything, but I think today we have the tools to be able to do quite a lot for several fronts. And if we know that things will keep coming, we need to find ways to circumvent the problems.
And a question I have, because I know, say, you work in support of agriculture, you don't dictate or control agriculture, but agricultural practices come into this. I mean, they set up ecosystem pressures, if you like. Some of the intensive animal practices obviously have environmental burdens. They carry the ever-present threat, maybe, that you might get some sort of genetic reassortment among different viral strains of influenza, which would lead to a dangerous pandemic strain emerging. And you guys have the scientific wherewithal to have that dialogue. I mean, you don't obviously have the sort of, well, you might have some of the regulatory oversight, but not you, but the USDA would. But how can you kind of progress that dialogue as well? It's a difficult conversation, but surely if that one world health or one health kind of vision is to be realized in any kind of meaningful way, that kind of conversation must be part of it too.
So I think to build on what we just said, you can't fight everyone at the same time, but you can, I think, move from a firefighting mode to more of a steady operational mode. And I think that probably starts with identifying a couple of emerging diseases and zoonotic diseases which are at a significant risk to spread over. And I think there's a long list that exists, be that Nipah or be that Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and flu, of course, is one of them. And then very, very clearly try to understand what is the epitope that in this specific virus is relevant, and maybe not develop to a full vaccine, but go to a certain point that allows you then, when the disease emerges, to be very fast in your response.
Okay.
You know, last year in the United States, we suffered the worst animal disease outbreak that we've ever suffered. It was a high-path avian influenza outbreak, which ended up in the loss of some 45 million birds, egg-laying hens, and turkeys. Now, we were very fortunate that it wasn't zoonotic, because if it was zoonotic, I mean, we would have been in trouble. And we didn't have a vaccine. Here's another challenge. You know, when you look at poultry, you know, thank goodness that virus didn't spread to the East Coast of the United States, where we produce most of our broilers. In the United States, we produce 9 billion, close to 9 billion broilers a year, chicken meat, which provides, you know, an economical source of protein for a lot of our citizens. But how do you vaccinate broilers? I mean, if it was zoonotic, as previously mentioned, you'd want to control it at the source. So it brings out additional challenges. How do you deliver? And you can't inoculate every bird. And this is where research becomes important. And every time we have a new disease outbreak, on the human side, you look at Zika virus. We don't know a lot about these emerging diseases, and that's why the researchers, both in academia and government, play a key role in very quickly generating the scientific information about this virus so that it can be controlled and hopefully as quickly as possible, you know, develop a vaccine. That's going to be one of the big challenges of the future. How can we quickly develop a vaccine to prevent and control an emerging zoonotic disease?
I think I need to move to the next session, if that's okay. I'm just looking at, we're under a little bit of time pressure. But thank you both, all of you, very much.